Well, hello and welcome along to this latest Solus webinar, which is the final one of 2020. Today, we're going to be thinking about the important issue of loneliness, and we've entitled our discussion, Silent Nights, Navigating Loneliness and Longing in a COVID Christmas. And I'm delighted today to be joined by Ed Shaw. Ed is pastor of Emmanuel City Centre, which is a church in Bristol in England. He also leads Living Out, which is a Christian charity supporting and resourcing Christians around issues of sexuality, and also an organisation that challenges some of the cultural narratives around that issue. But he's also a writer on platforms such as the Gospel Coalition and the author of the book, The Plausibility Problem, The Church and Same-Sex Attraction. And I actually believe he's also got another book in the pipeline on purposeful sexuality. So we're delighted to have him. Enough of this impressive resume. Let's meet the man himself. Ed, we're thrilled to have you with us. Welcome to the webinar.
It's great to be with you.
How are things with you at the minute? I know that this is a busy season for churches and pastors. How are things going?
Yeah, we're trying to work out what Christmas and COVID look like together. We've had some good carol services. We've had an Advent calendar trail here in Bristol run by members of the church family. We've got carols coming up in car parks, but also really looking forward to this Sunday and a couple of more. Well, I hope to do some more traditional sort of style carols services in our church building, but without anybody actually being able to sing, which will be rather weird, but there we are.
Yeah, it's all unprecedented. It's just a year of unprecedented church ministry, but we're really grateful that you've taken the time out of what is obviously a busy few weeks to just be with us and contribute to this topic. And we're really looking forward to hearing from you in a few minutes. Before we do hear from Ed, I want to invite you watching live to get involved in our discussion, and to do that by submitting your questions. And as ever on our Solus webinars, you can do that via the Pigeonhole platform. You'll see the address coming up on the screen. It's pigeonhole.at/solus16DEC. I'm sure many of you will have all sorts of questions on this particular topic. We really feel free now, or throughout the webinar, or once we jump into the Q. Submit your questions, and we'll be delighted later on, after we do a little bit of an interview with Ed, to submit those questions to him and to see how he will answer them for us. So we're really looking forward to that. Just before the Q&A, I'll also be giving you some information on how you can get your hands on a book that Ed has contributed to. The book's called Healthy Faith in a Coronavirus Crisis, Thriving in the COVID-19 Pandemic. Ed, I'm going to ask you about your specific chapter in this book in a few moments, but I wonder, could you just tell us a little bit about the book in general, what it was trying to do, and why we should get our hands on it?
Yeah, I think when COVID first, as it were, hit the UK in particular back in March, Christine Mayer and Luke Corley got a group of people together and said, look, we need to write something that's going to help people cope through lockdown. It's going to help our churches survive and thrive in the midst of lockdown. And so they got in contact with a whole number of people, including me, and asked us to write particular chapters that might help different people in different ways during the COVID experience. And I suspected they thought that the shelf life of the book would just be a few months, but actually it turns out the shelf life of the book is going to be longer than that. It's going to be really useful for us now as it was back in March. And it's just got chapters on everything from how to think about death as a Christian, to how to thrive in your marriage, to how to be a good parent, to how just to cope with the stress of just everything that's happened over the last few months, and as well as a chapter on things like loneliness, a great chapter on singleness by my friend Kate Wharton. It's just one of those books which because it's multi-author, has just got something for everybody, both, as it were, on a subject that you all care about as an individual, and also written by somebody like you who really connects with you. So like all multi-author books, it comes with the advantage of there'll be at least one, if not multiple chapters that you'll find particularly relevant to your situation.
Yeah, really helpful. Thank you. As somebody who's read the book, I can definitely second that. So we're at Solus are delighted to be able to give some copies away. And if you stick around for the next 20 minutes or so, we'll let you know how you can get your hands on it. Let's dive into our topic for this evening. Ed, before we think about sort of navigating loneliness, which is really what we're doing tonight, obviously we need to understand what it is and what we mean by it. We're hearing lots about loneliness in the news around the UK and elsewhere. This is not specific to one generation. It's not specific to one culture, even within the UK. Well before we were talking about a pandemic of coronavirus, we were talking about a pandemic of loneliness, and lockdown certainly compounded that for people and maybe introduced people to it who weren't aware of it. But I think if we're honest, if I'm honest, even with myself, it still seems a little bit abstract. And I guess it kind of gets caught up in all the statistics, and maybe we just sort of stereotype it to the elderly and see it as an elderly problem. Can you tell us a little bit about your own experience of the last 9 months and how that's related to this particular issue?
Yeah, so I spent the first sort of lockdown one, if you can remember back to those distant days, what was it, March, April, May? I spent that period alone here in my home in Bristol. I was completely alone. Nobody else lives with me. And so I had that experience of loneliness because there was nobody else here. And if you remember back at the beginning, the restrictions on who you could see outside were, well, basically you couldn't see anybody. You might happen to bump into somebody on the way to the shops or on your an hour's walk or exercise. But basically you were told to stay alone by yourself if you happen to live alone. And I guess that is what most of us think about when we think about loneliness. We think about somebody living, as it were, completely alone without any company, and that being really difficult. And yeah, it was really difficult. I found that experience of being physically alone painful in every sort of way, physically painful in some ways, because we all need the company of other people. We need people to talk through things with, and we need people to be physically present. They think I've realized how important it is to have that experience of people just being in a room with you. Things like this are great, Zoom's great, phone calls are great, but actually physically being alone is a really difficult thing. And I certainly struggled with that right back at the beginning when I was physically alone. But I think there's a danger of just seeing loneliness as somebody being alone physically, somebody not having people around them, because actually loneliness is much bigger than that. And a lot of us would have experienced loneliness of a different kind during COVID or at other times in our lives. And that's the experience of being surrounded by people, having loads of people in our lives, perhaps sharing a house with loads of people, but really having a sense that nobody gets you, that nobody connects with you, that although they're physically present, nobody quite knows you as an individual. And that's another form of loneliness that is out there that I felt at various stages of our life. I think we've all felt at various stages of our lives, perhaps being surrounded by people, but feeling that nobody quite gets who we are. And I think it's probably helpful when we're talking about loneliness to remember we're not just talking about people living alone. We're talking about people going through experiences, times in their life when they feel that nobody else quite connects, gets with what they're going through. And that can be out of an experience of grief or depression or a question around somebody's sexuality. It could be a whole host of things that produce that sense of loneliness. Nobody else quite understands who I am, what I'm going through. And actually, one of the lessons of COVID for me has been how universal the experience of loneliness is. It's not just been something that those of us who live alone have experienced during COVID. It's actually something all of us experienced at some point, because we've all had a sense over the last 8-9 months that actually, even if we're surrounded by people, nobody else is quite understanding the particular pressures on us, how we, with the personality God's given us, are responding to all that's been happening in our country and in this world.
Yeah, and that is really helpful. Obviously, you take this topic on in the chapter that you wrote for Healthy Faith. And can you tell us a little bit about why you felt that was going to be particularly important for navigating not just life, but obviously our faith, this relationship between loneliness and faith? Because, you know, in my research for this, one of the topics interesting to me that kept on coming up around this issue of loneliness was this idea of shame. And I remember when I was reading your chapter in the book, you mentioned a quote by a philosopher who talked about this idea of it's not necessarily being physically alone, it's being in company with other people who just don't get you. And of course, that can bring a sense of shame, that either there's a shame that there's something wrong with you in that no one wants to be around you, so that's the physical distance, but also then the emotional or the experiential difference when you might be around people, but they just don't get you. And so in that sense, you're alone together, you know, to kind of
Yeah, I mean, one of the funniest things for me right at the beginning of lockdown was when I got this invitation to write a chapter on loneliness. And I love the fact that there were people having a conversation, unbeknownst to me, who were thinking, you know, who out there could write? Who's an expert on loneliness? Who could we get to write something? Ed Shaw, he'll be the man. He's a lonely person. He'll write something on loneliness. I mean, you know, that actually cheered me up ridiculously in the first few weeks of lockdown, just the fact that somebody had clearly had that conversation. Yeah, I mean, loneliness, because it comes in various forms, is a challenge for all of us, and we all need to develop the spiritual resources to face loneliness with. Because although we might not be physically alone at the moment, we might not feel as if people don't understand us at the moment, there will be times in our lives when we are physically alone, and when we do feel that nobody else quite gets us. So what I was hoping to do in the chapter was remind myself of the spiritual resources that are available, and also point other people to them too. And obviously, the greatest spiritual resource is unsurprisingly Jesus himself. What I find so comforting about being a Christian is that I'm following someone who knows what it's like to live a human life. And in Jesus, we meet somebody who knows what it's like to be lonely. He knows what it's like to be physically alone. Just think of some of his last words on the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? Jesus has experienced, I think, the greatest form of loneliness as he cries out those words of anguish to his Father in heaven as their previously perfect relationship is broken in some shape or form. He knows what it's like to be completely, utterly alone. And just knowing that when we feel physically alone, that Jesus understands, that Jesus gets it, helps us with that second form of loneliness, that sense that nobody else quite knows how I feel. Well, Jesus does know exactly how we feel when we're physically alone. And he went through countless experiences when nobody quite got who he was. I mean, just think of his experience of being the God-man and walking around this planet and facing all the opposition he did, or facing all the confusion from his disciples he did about who he was. How people couldn't make sense of him. People couldn't make sense of this human being that did godlike things. And so when we have that sense of nobody quite makes sense of me, nobody quite understands who I am, well, Jesus has been there too. Nobody quite made sense of him until he'd risen again. Nobody could quite work out what was going on in him until he was raised from the dead after 3 days. So for me, one of the delights of writing a chapter on loneliness was being made to look at Jesus again and to be reminded yet again that when it comes to loneliness in all its forms, Jesus has been there. Jesus can say to me, I know how you feel. Jesus can say to me, I know what you're going through. And particularly in the months when there was nobody else, as it were, physically present in my life, in my home, it was a help and a comfort to know that Jesus was spiritually present with me.
I want to just unpack or dig a little bit deeper into this question of why is this a particular problem for us as human beings, and why is it a universal issue? Obviously, we can look at sort of animal life and see that, there are some animals that are real social beings. There are others that sort of live in isolation. But for us as humans, this seems to be a particular problem. I was reading a rather brilliant short essay by an American writer called Claire Bushy, who published a little essay in the Financial Times recently called "Loneliness in Me," and she put it so beautifully when she said this: "I am lonely as the body is hungry 3 times a day, hollowed again and again by the ache that does not ease except with the sustenance of connection. The feeling is different from the peace of solitude which many enjoy, including me at times. Instead, it is a gnawing sadness. Even before the pandemic, a combination of circumstance and choice left me with fewer close ties than I wanted. But every day I forage for connection, and some days I grow hungry." And why as human beings is this a particular problem? Are we wired for something that loneliness highlights we don't have? She's using the metaphor of hunger. There does seem to be that gap, that something is not being filled in us.
Yeah, and we hunger for connection because we were created for connection. We hunger for other people because we are created to live in community with other people. We are communal creatures, which is not a surprise because we were created by a communal God, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. They have been dwelling together in a community for all of time, and they have created us in their image. And unsurprisingly, they've created us to be communal creatures, to hunger for a relationship with them, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, but also to hunger for a relationship with other human beings. And for me, one of the most sort of striking verses in the early part of the Bible is the famous verse, Genesis 2, verse 18. The world's perfect. God's looking at his creation. God's looking at the first man that he's created. And we hear this. The Lord God said, "It is not good for the man to be alone. I will make a helper suitable for him." Really striking, isn't it? That when the first human being was enjoying a perfect world and had a perfect relationship with the creator God of the universe, he still needed something else. And God created the first woman and the community that sprung from that first man and the woman as a response to that need for connection between human beings. And that accounts for the hunger that we all have for connection. We're created to be in a relationship with God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, but we're also created to need other people and to need relationships and intimacy with other human beings. And it's just really important to sort of grasp that biblically, as we have grasped that experientially over the last year. I mean, I know that some people would, have said to me, "Oh, this whole experience has made me question whether, the Bible's view on things is right." I've actually said in response to that, no, actually, my experience of loneliness, my desire for connection with other people, and how I haven't been able to express that and realize that in the way that I've longed to this year, has actually been a confirmation of what the Bible says about what it means to be a human being. Confirmation that the God who said it's not good for man to be alone, for human beings to be alone, has got it right, knows us perhaps better than we know ourselves.
Yeah, really helpful. I wonder, could you say a word about, from your experience, how you find Christmas to be a time where this is felt perhaps more acutely? I'm thinking even, there's a sense in which we're aware that Christmas makes loneliness more difficult. There was a John Lewis advert not that long ago, which was really popular, called "The Man in the Moon." And again, it was about this remote, elderly old man only seen by this little girl, but obviously she reached out, and it was trying to address this issue. How does Christmas make it difficult to navigate loneliness?
Oh, well, because I suppose the perfect Christmas is meant to be, isn't it? This big scene of a whole multi-generational family all gathering around a table with a massive turkey in the middle and all enjoying themselves. And it's meant to be all about a community and harmony and not being alone. That's what all the publicity sort of shows, isn't it? That Christmas is a community, a communal thing. And that can be, can be terribly isolating for people like me who are single, but also be actually terribly isolating for most people, because there's so much expectation of what it's going to be. So often Christmas is crushed, isn't it, by that expectation of what it should be. And actually, the perfect family Christmas doesn't happen, mainly because there was so much pressure on it being the perfect family Christmas. And actually, if we just treated it as another day in which families gather and sometimes things go wrong and sometimes people continue to annoy each other as much as they have for the rest of the year, we'd recognize that Christmas can actually be a time both for single people, but also everybody else when they feel lonely. Because you can be lonely on your own if you're spending Christmas alone, but you could also, back to our definition of loneliness, be in a room full of your friends or full of family and still be thinking, but these people don't get me. These people don't understand me. These people haven't asked how I'm doing. These people don't really know what's going on in my life. If these people knew this thing about me, they'd reject me, or whatever it might be. Yeah. So, there's just loads of expectations and pressures on Christmas, aren't there, that sometimes kill it off for us.
Yeah, and it seems to me that there's a particular paradox in our specific cultural moment, in that, in a sense, we're in some ways as a society more connected than ever. Certainly digitally, we've more ways to be connected than ever, and yet at the same time, perhaps we're more lonely than we've ever been. So, what is that saying about our need for intimacy, but also the ability of perhaps these other platforms for connection to actually provide the intimacy that we need?
Yeah, I think basically, if we think of Facebook friends, there's actually, you friend somebody on Facebook. That has become at one level the new definition of friendship, hasn't it? I'm friends with them on Facebook. What does that tend to mean? I once met them at a party. I worked with them 5 years ago. We went to school together. It's not really friendship. It's, they are an acquaintance of mine. We need to, as it were, rescue the whole concept of friendship from Facebook and actually think of what true friendship is. And true friendship is a really intimate thing. Friends are people who are there for you. Friends are people who let you into their own lives, let you into what's going on inside them. And if you're going to be a good friend, you're going to reciprocate by doing the same. Friends are the people you turn to instinctively when things go wrong, and who will pick up the phone, who will pop around if they possibly can when things happen. And we've got to sort of, I think, rescue friendship from just being something you click, I'm their friend, to actually something that means a lot, something that actually costs a lot, because friendship's self-sacrificial, something that, again, isn't ruined by a perfectionism, which I think a lot of friendships are. A friend needs to be absolutely perfect. If my friends let me down in any way, they're out the door, rather than actually friendship, like all human relationships, is something to be worked upon, something that develops over time, something that's strengthened by the first time actually you need to say sorry, the first time you need to forgive. So I think, fundamentally, it's really interesting that God's answer to the problem of loneliness that he spots in Genesis 2, verse 18, isn't marriage. It's often seen to be marriage. No, the answer that God provides to the problem of loneliness is human community, is a network of relationships with family, but with friends, and with a network of people who together can help us, and together we can be involved in helping too.
Obviously, you're navigating this as a Christian, and other people navigate it in different ways. You've mentioned a little bit throughout already in terms of how your Christian faith helps you and resources you, both to understand it, but also to move through it as effectively as possible, I guess. I wonder, could you maybe say a little bit more about how perhaps the Christian story, and maybe even the Christmas story, as we understand it, might uniquely sort of contribute to this discussion and resource us to navigate this? Like we've talked about the example of Jesus, we've talked about the foundation of community and made to be social beings. Is there anything else that you think might be helpful for us to think about?
I was watching a famous, I think it's quite funny, famous sort of little video on YouTube yesterday about the difference between sympathy and empathy, and how sympathy is when we're at the bottom of a hole and somebody shouts down from the top of the hole and sort of says, "Oh, it must be quite difficult down there," and says some other sympathetic things, but basically doesn't really help you. And empathy is when somebody climbs down into the hole and sits at the bottom with you and shares your experience and doesn't just share cliches with you, actually listens to you and hears what you're going through and shares the experience with you. And I think the wonderful good news of the incarnation is that God isn't, as it were, up in heaven just sharing a bit of sympathy with us, isn't just saying to us, "Well, I'm really sorry that it's difficult down there. It must be very tricky. Keep going." No, the great news about Christmas, the great news of the incarnation, is God coming down into our world and living a human life and experiencing the full range of human experiences and emotions, from happiness to sadness, from anger to joy, everything, experiencing those emotions, being on the receiving end of those emotions, and as a result, knowing what it's like and actually being able to empathize with what it means to be a human being. And then also not just empathize, because again, of course, the Christmas story ends with the Easter story and the hope that gives us of getting out of the hole, as it were, sometime soon, of being able to live in a world, a new creation, where loneliness is never part of anybody's experience ever again. So I love just how the Christmas to Easter thing speaks into loneliness and gives us, as it were, company, comfort, and also joy.
Yeah, it's incredible, because obviously that's the heart of Christmas as well, like you say, isn't it? God coming among us and actually becoming a human being, knowing what our experience is like. And you would assume then that sets an incredible precedent for those who follow Jesus to do likewise, to step into the lives of other people. I haven't really prepared to ask you this question, Ed, so I hope this is okay. But I wonder, could you talk a little bit about that as a pastor and somebody, obviously as a Christian yourself, but obviously somebody who leads Christians, because I don't think this is a uniquely Christian thing that people are calling for. Again, a lot of the secular writers that I've read on this are talking about how loneliness opens up this whole question of how we define friendship that you've talked about, also how we make use of our time, and even, and I guess this connects to some of your living out stuff as well. Again, just this, I found this so interesting that Claire Bushy wrote this. She says, a lonely world would be better served if there were more models and visibility of cohabitation between non-romantic partners. So she talks about kind of the idealization of marriage as the antidote to this. I would assume that you might have one or two things to say about that, because there is a danger that the church can kind of blow that trumpet as well. So any thoughts around that?
Yeah, so I think our society is basically saying the answer to loneliness is the nuclear family. So you've got to find one other person and you've got to sort of build a community with them, have kids. That's the answer to loneliness. It isn't. One of the reflections I've had with a staff colleague, friend here at Emmanuel, was she was just saying to me, actually, everybody's lonely. And I think one of the reasons why everybody's lonely in our society today is that we've restricted sort of how our relation needs are going to be met to one other person and any other people that couple produce or look after together. That is not a way to be healthy human beings. We actually need to have a vision of society that isn't all about all these nuclear families. Instead, our vision, the Christian vision for society, is one family, the local church, for instance, made up of loads of other little families, but acting as one family. This is actually why it's been really difficult to be a Christian, to be a church family during COVID, because the one thing that the government does not want to happen at the moment is lots of people behaving like one family, one household, when actually that's what my local church is always trying to do. We're trying to be one household, one family made up of loads of other little families. And that one family doing all the things that nuclear families often do, but doing it on a bigger scale, which includes more people and which supports singles and married and the bereaved and all the sort of various relational sort of contexts in which people find themselves in. I think, the sort of article you're talking about saying, actually, we need to just sort of think about ways in which people can share life more. We don't want to silo everybody off into nuclear families. Instead, we need to be thinking much more as a society, and the church need to be demonstrating that we can do this well by showing that actually human life's best lived when households, as it were, put themselves in a bigger family, in a bigger relational context. And for me, that's the local church. That's what local churches should be doing, can be doing. We're finding it hard to do under the current restrictions, but that's what church family is all about. I think people often think church family is just a sort of nice bit of PR. It's actually a theological reality that I am related forever, eternally, with my brothers and sisters in Christ at Emmanuel City Centre. And I need to behave like that in the way that I care for them, look out for them. And in some ways, they have a higher call on me than my nuclear family, because I'm going to be with my church family forever.
Really helpful. And as you say, it seems like the church should be that solution, not necessarily marriage, but the church as family. That is that model, in a sense, of cohabiting, doing life together in non-romantic relationships that this author is looking for. Before we jump into Q&A, I just want to ask a final question, because obviously this is a practical issue, and loneliness is a practical challenge as much as an experiential or a theoretical one. As a pastor, as somebody who's clearly thought about this, is working through it at times yourself, would you have any practical advice for people who are worried about experiencing loneliness this Christmas, or even then for churches, as to how do they be that family that you've been talking about and mitigate that loneliness that people in either their church itself or in the local community might be experiencing this Christmas?
I think probably a sort of individual level, I think one of the biggest dangers you can fall into when you're lonely is a sort of spiral down. And sometimes the times when I'm most struggling with being alone, I spiral down. The most thing I need to do is get out, in the current circumstances, get out on a walk with somebody else and stop feeling so sorry for myself. And it's just worth watching that spiral down that we can all sometimes fall into. Get out. When you are feeling lonely, the thing you most need is some time with somebody else. And under the current regulations where I'm in Bristol, the one way that can happen is a walk outside. So get on a walk outside. And when somebody offers, take it. Even if you're not feeling like it, you need it, so do it. That would be a sort of very practical piece of advice when it comes to sort of an individual level. And then when it comes to stuff like the whole loneliness of I'm the only one that feels this way, start talking about your feelings, start talking about what's going on in your life, and you'll find that you're not the only person that feels that way. And the way that actually friendships develop and intimacy develops in friendships is you sharing what's going on inside of you and finding other people that either experience something very similar, something exactly the same, or have experienced similar emotions in a totally different area of life, but can connect with you still. One of the sad things is that we often keep loneliness going by actually not sharing what's going on inside us and not finding the people that actually will say, actually, no, I do know what you mean. I've experienced exactly that in a really different situation, but I do know what you mean. And actually that in and of itself is a sort of a loneliness defeater, actually sharing what's going on and being open and honest. If we want to defeat loneliness, which I certainly do, we need to, as it were, sometimes get ourselves outside, get ourselves talking, get ourselves sharing what's really going on. And when it comes to church families, I think we need to be thinking, what does a good functioning nuclear family share? How much more should a church family share meals, holidays, money, time, walks, presents, family life, all those things.
Yeah, really helpful. There's some more practical questions that are actually coming in on Pigeonhole, so we'll get to those in just a minute. Ed, we'll give you a break for a couple of minutes. You can relax just now. But thank you to you who've been submitting questions on Pigeonhole. Let me remind you that you can continue to do that at pigeonhole.at/solus16 DEC, and you can submit any question that you want, and we'll try to get through it in the next 25 minutes or so. Just before we jump into that, I did promise you that I would let you know how you can get a copy of the book that we mentioned at the beginning, Healthy Faith and the Coronavirus Crisis, which Ed has contributed to. There's essentially two ways that you can do that. If you are already a friend and a supporter of Solus, and you give monthly to the work that we do, we'd love to throw you into a prize draw. And all you need to do to enter that prize draw is to email us at support@solus-cpc.org, and just tell us that you'd like to enter into the prize draw for the Healthy Faith book, and we'll pick out 3 names. We'll keep that open for the next 48 hours or so, and then we'll draw 3 names from those who've entered in, and we'll get a free copy to you. But the other way is for those of you who are not yet supporters of Solus, and you would like to perhaps get behind the evangelism and the evangelism training that we do, including these webinars. You can actually begin to donate. So you can go to our website, solus-cpc.org /donate. And for just £3 a month, that's all we ask people to support us with. The price of a coffee. You can sign up for just £3 a month, and we'll be extremely grateful for that generous gift that you give us. Now, for all supporters at any point who do sign up for £3 a month, you'll see on the website that you can get a free book. There's a list of books by our speakers and associates that you can pick one from. But in addition to that free book that we always give away, if you sign up off the back of this particular webinar, then we'd be delighted to send you a copy of the Healthy Faith book, just as a thank you for us. So really appreciate you guys getting behind us. We're always blessed and encouraged by those who choose to support us, and it will be our honor to send you those books as a thank you. Okay, your questions have been coming in on Pigeonhole. Thank you very much for sending those in. Keep submitting those in, again, at pigeonhole.at/solus16 DEC. But let's get into some of the questions that you have already asked. And top of the list, Ed, is this particular one. Again, it's a practical question, but it's specific actually to young people. So we have a question here that says, any particular advice for loneliness among young people at this time? They've had so much of their year disrupted. School, the normal summer activities that they're involved in were completely wiped out. Any advice as a leader, as somebody involved with young people, I'm sure in your church, for how to help young people perhaps navigate loneliness?
Yeah, thank you. Just a few random things. I think one of the things I've done a little bit more, and this might be something that younger people haven't tried, is actually using the telephone rather than something like this online where you see people zooming people. I've actually found that there's something about Zoom, and there's something about the sort of seeing somebody but not being physically present and really missing that's actually helped by not seeing somebody, by actually just listening to their voice. And there's been some research to sort of confirm this. But actually, I found just using the phone sometimes has been better at not sort of lessening loneliness, because I'm not just thinking they're there and I can't really be with them. I'm just listening to their voice, paying actually more attention to their voice as a result. So oddly, using the phone rather than Zoom or whatever, FaceTime or whatever, would be one very small practical thing. Something else would be actually, anybody that knows me would be unsurprised to just to be reading. I think one of the things to talk about in my chapter in the book is that actually reading a good book that you enjoy, that transports you somewhere, or shares a similar experience, or describes a similar experience to your experience, that provides a bit of healthy escapism, can be really good for loneliness. And certainly a lot of the time during lockdown, I've enjoyed just enjoying the company of a good book, and the author of the book or the characters in a book can be really helpful, as can getting for a box set or something like that. So all these not as good as the real thing, but helpful things. And then I think the final thing is to, depending on which area of the UK you're in and what you're allowed to do, is just encouraging people to go on walks. I was talking to a friend this week who just was saying that actually he thinks that walks are the way that he can do friendship. The sort of walking alongside someone, not having too much sort of eye contact, as he said, actually has led to more openness in his friendships than ever before. And he was thinking actually just getting out on walks, sending people out on walks, arranging walks for people that you love might be a really good practical thing.
There's a question that's come in that's related to some of the things that we said towards the end of our little section there. It says, isn't the church's focus on the family the cause of loneliness among single people, either people who've never married or people who've been married and lost their spouse through circumstances or death?
Yeah, I could rant on this one for a long time. I think one of the things that the church has done in response to what have been perceived to be attacks on the nuclear family by a secular world is that we thought we were protecting the family by idolizing it, and by saying that, you know, the true Christian life, a fullness of life is experienced only if you are married and have kids. And I can see why that's happened, but it's not biblical Christianity. It's something that's never done in the New Testament. There's no idolization of the nuclear family in the New Testament. In fact, something once pointed out to me by the author Tim Chester is that actually Jesus himself says nothing positive about the nuclear family in the Gospels. In fact, he's calling people to leave behind families to follow him. And the reality is that he found the sort of community that he functioned with where his group of disciples, actually, you know, his family at one stage thought he should be locked away. So we've got to follow Jesus' example and note that actually he, as it were, was in a relationship with a group of friends. They were his family for all functional purposes. And the Apostle Paul, not married, didn't have kids, and yet Romans 6 and the whole list of people that, as it were, Paul mentions there as this sort of Oscar sort of winning speech at the end of Romans 16 shows that he was part of a whole network of relationships and wasn't, as it were, just tied into it's your nuclear family that are there to look after you sort of philosophy that is sadly a part of Western society and a part of a lot of our churches. So I agree with the question. I think it's a real problem, and I think we need to do everything we can in our churches to make sure that church family is family. It's a family made up of loads of different households, but it's family, and that everybody feels part of that: single, divorced, widowed, and those, you know, who are there with 2.4 children.
There's a question here that's picking up on the second definition of loneliness that we talked about, that idea of being around people but being disconnected from them. Somebody has asked here, how do we get connected with others when we are around them? I'm sure it's a mutual thing, but in terms of our own responsibility, are there any ways that we can connect with people when we perhaps feel like that, or when we struggle to sort of relate to them and they to us?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it's choosing the right sort of social event where actually you can have a genuine conversation with somebody. We've probably all been to multiple social events where actually it's hard to have a genuine conversation with anybody. I mean, a classic example from pre-COVID days is church tea and coffee times, where it's really hard to have a proper conversation with anybody. Everybody's milling around and nobody actually seems to sort of sit down and actually have a proper conversation. one of the things we've talked about every so often in my church family is actually using tea and coffee time, not just to have a whole series of inconsequential small talk conversations with, multiple people over a 20-minute, half an hour period, but actually to find somebody and to sit down and actually have a proper conversation and actually ask each other the question, how are you? And give people the chance to answer it. I don't know about your church, but my church, often we ask the question, how are you, just as a greeting. There's no intention of really listening to the answer or actually giving an answer. If we really want to build friendships, we need to ask that question in a context in which somebody can say, it's been a horrific week. I haven't spoken to my husband since the day before yesterday. Or I was so cross with my mother this week that I totally lost my temper with her, or whatever it might be. Or it's been actually a really good week. I think I've met somebody who might be the person of my dreams, or I have had a great week. I got promoted. Whatever it might be, we should be able to ask that question, how are you? And give people the chance to genuinely respond. And I think to get ourselves in the position where we can think, yeah, I would be able to honestly answer that question. I will be able to ask that question and, as it were, hang around for a response is the sort of thing that we need to be doing more of. And encouraging more of, and thinking about, what about our social lives actually stops genuine conversation from happening? And there are other things that do. But asking genuine questions and getting genuine answers, I think, is the way that the door to open up to all of this.
There's a couple of tougher questions, certainly in their tone, that's coming. At Solus, we love tough questions, so apologies, Ed. Welcome to our world a little bit. But this one's a little bit more punchy. It asks, why are you focusing on these first world problems that the word snowflakes is used? Isn't Christianity supposed to be about solving sin and starvation and not pandering to this needy, me-centered psychobabble?
Thanks for the question. I mean, just picking up on some of the language, what's interesting is that this is less of a third world problem, because actually people in the third world live in communities in which they are dependent on each other and live in multi-generational families and don't have the levels of privacy that we have, and therefore actually have genuine community. And communities are big families in which people are reliant on each other, and where everybody knows that to thrive as human beings, to survive as human beings, they need to look out for each other. And it's just worth us recognizing that actually, in some ways, loneliness is a first world problem. So many mental health issues that so many in our society today face are first world problems because of how we live our lives in isolation, out of community, wanting to be independent rather than interdependent. So in some ways, I want to agree with that question. The pushback is actually we've got a lot to learn from other parts of the world where they do this much, much better. But at the same time, we want to say that one of the things that should encourage us to take the felt needs of our society seriously, and the levels of loneliness in our society seriously, the levels of mental health issues in our society seriously, is that God so loved the world that he sent his only son, that he has a love and concern for us and the experiences we're going through, the issues we're struggling with. And as Christians, we want to be like him, and we want to help people see that the answer to the presenting issue of loneliness is found in the gospel, in a relationship with Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and in a relationship with other people that is deepened and opened up in new and everlasting ways through the reconciliation that Jesus brings in his death on the cross.
There's a question here about why God would even allow us to become lonely and to experience the deep pain and trauma, I guess, of the experience of loneliness. If God made us for community, if God knows that we do have that hunger for intimacy and connection, why would he allow us, if he's loving and compassionate, to go through these kinds of experiences?
Well, from a Christian worldview, the answer at one level to that question is that we made the decision that has left us lonely. So God said it's not good for us to be alone. He provided in himself and in other people the answer to that loneliness. But we walked away from a relationship with him, and that had consequences for that relationship with him that's left us lonely. And also it has consequences on a relationship with other people too. And it's brought conflict, and it's brought separation, and it's brought feelings of shame. And I can't share that with that person, feelings of rejection into our relationships, not just with God, but with other people. In biblical terms, this is the fall, this is Genesis 3, and the consequences of us shutting God out and the effect that's had on everything else, our relationship with creation around us, particularly other people. So we're living the consequences of decisions that were made by human beings like us, and also, let's be honest, decisions that we often make too. The reasons that I'm lonely are because of other people and how they've responded to me, but often also, a lot of the time, they're because of me and decisions I've made and ways in which I've been rude or angry, or ways in which I've shut people out of my lives and haven't let them in, ways in which I've wanted to live my life independently and not be interdependent. And we've probably all got to recognize that some of our loneliness issues, as it were, have been done to us by society, by other people, but some of our issues around experiences around loneliness are things that we have caused ourselves from decisions we've made ourselves, responses we've had ourselves to people around us. So, we are to blame to a very large extent. What's wonderful is how God doesn't leave us alone in our loneliness and provides an answer to our loneliness in a way that nobody else does. Without God, life is lonely. Without the hope of a relationship with him, be restored to that relationship with him, will be forever lonely. Without the sort of depth of relationship that Christian community should provide, and the length of that community, the fact that it will go on forever, we will be lonely, and we will have to face eternity alone. So God wonderfully, beautifully speaks into our loneliness, shares our loneliness, and one day will end our loneliness.
Yeah. I want to exercise chairperson's privilege and just finish by asking you a question about the church, and again, this role that the church plays. I wonder if you could leave us with perhaps some advice of someone who perhaps has been dropping into church services online during lockdown and things like that, and would like to come along. And sometimes that can be the most intimidating, but also a very lonely experience for somebody who doesn't really know anyone. So would you have any advice for somebody who's afraid of maybe that experience? And then also from the other angle, where does this church family need to step up, and how do we need to think in this particular area for those sorts of people?
Yeah, it's lovely, isn't it, to have during this experience of lockdown people who in some ways are able to look in on church meetings in a sort of what feels like a safe way. But I would encourage people, if that's you, that you've enjoyed the safety of sort of looking in without being seen. I'd love to encourage you to actually, when you can, go into a physical meeting and, as it were, start taking the opportunity to actually build relationships. And as you do that, and as you perhaps worry about doing that, I think, just one of the best things you can do is actually arrive and say to the person who is at the door, or go to the person who's led the meeting, or the pastor, or just somebody who looks as though they're part of the furniture, and actually say, this is my first time. I've been watching on whatever. Basically, just say, I am here for the first time. I'd love to meet people. Just actually go and say, this is me. I need your help. That, just from a pastor's point of view, is really helpful, just to have somebody come up to you and say, I'm new, help me meet other people. And I just encourage you, when you first, as it were, get back into a physical meeting, and that's possible, just to make that connection and say, I'm new, please help me other people. And different churches have different ways of making that happen. It'll be, joining into a small group in some churches. It'll be invited around to somebody's house in another church for a meal. There'll be loads of different ways that different churches do it. But in some ways, they need to know you exist, and they need to know that you want to get to know them. So just be open and bold in doing that. And then I think, from the church's point of view, we've got to, particularly when people come on their own, recognize how difficult that is. Pray for the spiritual sensitivity that we need to sometimes work out actually whether somebody is still looking in and they actually don't want too much interaction at the moment, and actually where they really do want interaction. And then to make sure that we provide that and make sure that we give people who are coming on their own chances to get to know each other, chances to get to know each other, not just in a small talk way, but in a deep way. And I'm always challenging everybody in my church family to be thinking about how we can make sure that we are still, as it were, keeping up with our existing friends and still being friends to them, but also still always having a sort of an open attitude towards others, drawing other people into our friendship groups and making sure that everybody gets an experience of real, genuine church community. And that's by looking out and drawing new people in and connecting new people. And actually the person that you should really meet is this, or the family that actually you already get on with this family, or whatever it might be.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we're out of time, and that's all we have for this particular webinar. But for those of you watching, I want to thank Ed for joining us today and serving us so well with his insights and advice. Ed, before we let you go, how can we be praying for you specifically at this time, for those who are watching, and even for us as a Solus ministry?
I mean, I just, for a happy Christmas in which I remember the good news of Christmas and both, as it were, get a rest, but also serve other people. One of the nice things about this Christmas is very different, where all my normal defaults aren't happening. It's a chance to build some new traditions and to have people around here that I wouldn't normally have around at Christmas, and to actually not just spend the whole of the Christmas holiday with my nuclear family, but actually to spend time with my church family. So pray that in the midst of all that change, I have a happy Christmas, that those who have to spend Christmas with me this year also have a happy Christmas. But that instead of the experience of loneliness we perhaps fear, there's actually a genuine experience of community with God and with others.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much. My thanks to Ed. My thanks also to Tim Allen, who is part of the Solus team, who's been in the background running production and keeping the technology moving so smoothly for us. And finally, just thanks to you. Thank you for submitting your questions. Thank you for joining us. We hope this has been an encouragement and it helped you. If it has, feel free to share it among others who you think might benefit from it. But for now, thank you so much for watching. May God bless you. On behalf of all of us at Solus, we want to wish you a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. And we'll see you with more webinars in the new year. But thank you and goodbye for now.